Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth workshop of Teks called Lorenzo Thomas's Aural Design. If you're watching, please do say hello in the chat. First, before we begin, I would like to say that this series is made possible thanks to Queen's Council on the Arts, a New Works grant, which received funding from New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and the City Council. Okay, let's begin. Okay. Okay. So, if you didn't know this about Lorenzo Thomas, he's actually a poet that was raised in Southeast Queens, where I currently live. And a lot of his work was influenced by music and mythology, as you can see in the pictures below. And this was a quote from him talking about poetry. Poetry is an instrument that we study in order to free the spirit, to celebrate the ancestors. These two pictures right here are from his chapbook called Fit Music. And I feel like they're very fitting for the theme today in talking about Lorenzo Thomas's Radio-Poetics. In the first image, you see the god Neptune with a shell horn and his trident. And if you didn't know this about the name Neptune, the etymology of Neptune is the word nub, which means fog, mist, or cloud. So it's implying some sort of mystery. And of course, the ending of the name is tune. So I thought it was interesting that the name itself could mean tuning into a mystery. And then the second picture on the side is a kind of design that looks like a sun at the top. It's supposed to be Lady Liberty and a black sailor. And from the sun at the top, you see a kind of radiating downwards and different designs, kind of like the harmony or music of the spears. And then from that radiating downward, you end up at the world map below. So you see a kind of radio design on the page here as well. So what do I mean by Radio-Poetics? This quote is from Nick Sturm's The Fires Behind Him essay, and I think it encapsulates what I mean by Radio-Poetics. The oral and oral traditions, the heard and the said, are at the center of Thomas's earliest poems. He collages the increasingly media-saturated landscape of New York City with images of diasporic movements and with narratives about romance, distance, and time. The first poem in the collected poems begins, "The way Egyptians used to sit, she sits, listening to the radio," a line that merges hieroglyphic imagery with contemporary technology. Radios are present throughout Thomas's work, acting simultaneously as conduits for musical resistance and tools for narrative manipulation through the news. Her descent is like that of the music, Thomas writes, suggesting a liberatory union of aesthetics and politics that resonate with the poetics of Umbra. The Umbra workshop was a workshop in New York City that Lorenzo Thomas was part of. The age we live isn't the age we live in doesn't matter, the poem also proclaims. Some mix up, huh? So Nick Sturm mentioned that his poetics was a kind of liberatory poetics. So I was thinking, how can we see radio-poetics as a type of liberatory poetics? And here I list several ideas about what I was thinking of when I thought of radio-poetics. So one, a type of coding, basically the dynamic doubleness of poetry. It can balance between two motives of traditional and experimental, public and personal, as well as can be past and future. So there's this constant tension, dynamic tension between two different extremes that kind of gives a full sense of a being or a poetics. And the source I got that from was Duplicities of Power essay, which also mentions Amiri Baraka's work. Two, Sun Ra, who is actually an influence of Lorenzo Thomas's work, and he was also published in Umbra Workshops magazine. And so Sun Ra's concept of the my story or mystery as opposed to history, and basically the my story is the multiple limitless potentials of a personal story versus history, which tends to be a generic story and doesn't include the intricacies and specificities of a personal story. So this quote is from Sun Ra. They say that history repeats itself, but history is only his story. You haven't heard my story yet, but my story is different from his story. My story is not part of history because history repeats itself, but my story is endless. It never repeats itself. Why should it? A sunset does not repeat itself, neither does the sunrise. Nature never repeats itself. Why should I repeat myself? And there's a kind of twist in that quote. Basically, he's repeating himself throughout the quote, but it's kind of that trickster element, referring back to number one about coding, where he seems like he's repeating himself, but it's not quite the same kind of repetition over and over again. And just because he's repeating himself doesn't mean it's being said the same way each time. So thinking about just because something seems the same on the surface doesn't mean it's the same beneath that surface. That brings us to three, the alchemic transmission, or another way, a transmutation. So basically rematerializing universal observations through specific subjective perspectives or interpretations, aka stations. So you can have the radio, which holds all these different perspectives, and that's a kind of universal being, but the different stations and ways of communication are all different. And that goes the same for the objective versus the subjective, right? And then four, the invisible connections. Wait for this to disappear. Invisible connections and complexities of communication show a shared sense of lineages and of living together among common crises, a living archival sensibility. So this quote is from one of Lorenzo's poems. I have been a collector of tones, a sound keeper. And I think that's important in terms of thinking about uh, the community or collectives. I'm in a. Sorry. Um, his quote, I've been a collector of tones, a sound keeper. Um, so in thinking about like communities, right? Communities aren't this kind of generalized, everyone's the same, but is a collection of different kinds of peoples and different kinds of lineages and people living together. And in the same way that a radio holds different kinds of stations and different ways of communicating to the world. And this event that was from Poetry Project um, and featured Lorenzo Thomas in the event, I think also kind of further helps us think about the poet as a kind of radio that receives different messages from various different sources and speaks back what it receives through that kind of transmission or transmutation. So the event thermal byproducts, the energetic communication of one's surroundings. So how does a poet utilize energies around them, sensational, structural, spiritual, as poem material? How does a poem signal the conditions in which it was created? And what does a poem offer in return? Maybe insight, love, proof of life. Essentially, let's consider how visionaries spin confrontations with the immediate into an engagement with the timeless. And that reflects back to the elements I just talked about, the different ways a poet engages with the community, the doubleness of speech, that it's incorporating um, many different sources of communication and wordings and trying to weave that into a story. So this is from one of Lorenzo Thomas's poems from his collective poems anthology. And I think it basically formulates how he thought about his own poetics and radio poetics in general. I collected trash and added antique connotations, changed all the understanding of them who dig my collection. Made like I tolerated antagonism only to uplift the defamed. My people sing and dance it. I made bards of my excluded brothers when the bigots refused me my name. Been so poor, but a magnet with my shamed English. I have reclaimed the legends. So in this poem, you see how he takes basically everyday life as a poet, weaves it together and raises it to this kind of macro idea of the legends, right? This kind of hieroglyphic language of the radio, essentially. And he also mentions here, I made bards of my excluded brother. So again, the poet, the bards as a kind of radio themselves. And this is another one of his poems called Salt that also, I think, speaks to that as well. I was born a speck of sand, thus I engulf the oceans, all the oceans in the world. My couriers are waves who fetch and tote my messages and secrets. My missives and epistles, like nostalgic notes, are high-priced, briny sighs, collected by the sirens at the cresting of the tides. Within the swirls and jeweled shells of all the oceans in the world, dwelt echoing confirmations of my love songs. I was born, a speck of sand, so I engulfed the oceans, all the oceans in the world. And I think it's interesting that he used salt and sand as metaphors within the poem because they're crystals or these kind of holders of information as well. And thinking about the relationship to the radio again, the idea that the radio itself is this kind of crystal formation, and its interiors are made of like rocks from the earth. So in thinking of that relationship to radio poetics and salt as a preserver and holder of things as well as radio as well. So let's look at some more of his poems in fit music. So this is one of his chapbooks, Fit Music, that I mentioned earlier. We're going to read the first poem that's called Proem. And a proem is a kind of preamble or preface to a book or a speech that's supposed to explain what's going to happen in the rest of the work. Okay, so here it is. When poets beg acceptance for their lines, it's when ephemera and wisdom intertwine. When dull biography engulfs a poem, the poet shores his patron with a proem to raise his thought above the dross of life. Since life intrudes, the proem is a gloss. Deja vu, more or less. Most likely, more should fit, to hear this song or strife. You spent childhood rehearsing the Korean War. You fucked up in college and picked the wrong major. And in 66, everyone faked concern for Asia. It was all more fitting than you thought. The staging. When the orders come down for the Nam 4th of July, as is fitting, you implored the muses to fly from their nodding. You totaled the Chevy out of meanness. You whined and wondered how to escape this mess. And Lord, who to write to? There should be a Lord, if there must be a proem, you thought. But there was none. Only your drunken friends, your dope fiends and pimps, demon lovers, and girls dumb to the Morse code from space still arriving. While Zia suns crackled over the desert, you fled through archives in your brain, remembering acidulous hash and devotions, consecrated by the pain of navigating through wine in peaceful East Coast full of bare bodies and icy streets under neon. Now tropical death leaped before you. You wept. Wasteful when the car ran them down, and the orders came down, as your prophets demanded, strange FM stations, and astrological phone calls hastened to soothe you, saying, don't give a damn. It was time to be going. Vancouver or South Vietnam. And so this poem is about Lorenzo when he was drafted to the Vietnam War. And it's him basically talking about, once again, these different elements, the macro and the micro in his life. The ephemera being the micro, the everyday life, the things that come and go and pass, and this kind of eternal wisdom of the macro that intertwine. And that despite knowing some of the wisdom and tuning into some of the wisdom of this macro, the astrology, the mythology, the previous knowledge of wars, things seem to happen again as if that previous wisdom was forgot, and he gets still drafted and pulled into another war. And so there's that constant tension in the work itself of knowing what the past has happened, but still not being able to control it from happening as well. And also, this poem is written in iambic pentameter. So it's also that, once again, tension of this kind of like Western classical form that he's trying to speak through and talk about the reality of his life, but still speaking through this kind of westernized form. And here he talks about, it was all more fitting than you thought, the staging when the orders come down. So also thinking about theater and the idea of the theatrics of war, that he has to play a role in this war and follow the orders even though he knows what it's going to bring. And then the idea of orders, you can see him talk about strange FM stations. So these orders coming from something outside of him, something bigger than him, and he has no choice but to listen to them. So there's this doubleness about the higher powers of government that draft him into war, but also higher powers of the universe that control his fate in a sense. And all he can do is, in a sense, speak back to it as a poet. Now, if we go to one of the other poems in Fit Music, you see he continues to talk about astrology and radios as well. So here's one. So I'll just read. And still it is helpful to be here, gifted, solemn, ridiculously macho, this effeminate county. What remains is to be bargained away for another souvenir medallion, the truth. So thank you, Kathy. We will get together and smoke dope another evening, maybe tomorrow. And thanking Lucky Stars too, sending back reports from the seaside. Sun Yat Sen's final telegram. Sorry, all that is classified. We not too sure where you'll be when worlds collide. Sending back reports from the seaside. So you see here him saying sending back reports from the seaside, allude back to the image we saw of Neptune, and Neptune as this kind of siren sending back reports, and also the idea of sending reports or telegrams as a form of communication, and the different forms of communication throughout the poem that comes together as a kind of truth, as he says here. And I think it's interesting he says for another souvenir medallion that the truth essentially doesn't change anything. It's just a kind of receipt of these are all the things that have happened, right? So I think it's interesting that he calls it a souvenir, but not something that changes. It's just, it is what it is, a souvenir medallion. And here again, he mentions the sending back reports from the beach, sending back reports from the seaside, the mentioning of songs, and also the engagement with others. I put my hand to my lips and concentrate on your mistakes, how you bumped into the wrong individuals in the saloon and kept on smiling right on. This kind of engagement and dynamics of interacting with others. And here back to the idea of the macro of poetry and the micro. Among the reasons why the beach is beautiful is the music on the radio is all right because it has nothing to do with you and it still reminds me of something. So that has nothing to do with you is this kind of like the the outer macro higher power that is outside of you and your control, but you're still connected to it somehow, so it still reminds you of something. So like tuning into frequencies outside of your control that you're connected to. Okay. So let's go see another one of his chapbooks. So this is The Bathers that we'll be looking at. So The Bathers. So the photos that are in this chapbook are during the civil rights movement. You see that protesters are getting hosed down. So this first poem in the book is called Onion Bucket. All silence says music will follow. No one acts under any confusion. Your story so striking and remains unspoken. Floods in the mind. Each one trying now to instigate the flutter of light in your ear. The voice needling the flashy token. Your presence in some room disguised as the summer of the leaves. Hilltops held by the soft words of the running wind. What lie do you need more than this normal passion? And each thing says destroy one another or die. Like a natural introducing here on this planet to Europe, the natural, a piece of furniture, smell, taste some connection to your earth and realize nothing more than you need. Another view, nothing more than you need yourself, or that is beautiful, or your luck that speaks, lifting its shoulders out the language of the streets. Above, the sky worried into its own song. Solid rhythm. She stays too close for a letter, scared of a telegram. The fingers, the finger drum express, impatient blues, anxious blues. Her chemical song loud and bright in his dimension. This is the world. The vegetables are walking. So this is another poem that I think also represents his kind of radio poetics. The doubleness of speech, the your story so striking and remains unspoken. Right? There's elements of it that is hitting, and then there's elements that remain remain back and don't push forward into another's mind. But even in that kind of doubleness, the pushing forward and the remaining and staying back are basically striking in two different directions. Um, the flutter of light, that kind of flickering back and forth. And it's the flutter of light in your ear. So that kind of reminds you of the like origin stories of God speaking light into existence. And so receiving light in your ear is that kind of like radio radiating play on words. The flashy token, and what exactly is a flashy token, right? And thinking about the radio maybe as a kind of flashy token, right? It's this symbol, but its presence implies a kind of flickering back and forth between stations, and the self as a kind of flickering back and forth between this presence. And you see him continue this kind of doubleness throughout the poem. And that creates a kind of rhythm between things. Here he has lifting its shoulders out the language of the streets. So everyday language, but it gets lifted to something above. Again, the play between the macro and the micro. Uh, and that play is the rhythm between these two extremes. And here he mentions her chemical song, which goes back to the kind of alchemic transmutation I was talking about earlier. And I think it's interesting that he ends it on the vegetables are walking, because again, it's that doubleness. So vegetables are things that tend to not move, or the way they move isn't really noticeable in the same way that walking is seen as movement. So to have vegetables walking is something that is striking, and that kind of dynamicness of this thing that is seen as not moving versus this thing that is obviously moving, and you putting it together creates that different sense of being. And also, if you think about the radio, it's that idea again as well of this object that stays still, but it moves through many voices. In the title poem, The Bathers, here you see he uses his own set of hieroglyphs in the poem. So, The Bathers. We turned to fire when the water hit us. Something berserk regained, an outmoded regard for sanity. While in the fire station, no one thought of flame. Fame or fortune did them. We did them a fortune. We did them a favor just being ourselves inside of them. Holy day, children. In the nation coming, your children will learn all about that. But the water creep about us, water hit us with force. We saw a boy transformed into a lion. His tail is Val, the symbol of love. A master beat before fellow craft, the summit of the royal arch. Lotus, mover on the face of the waters. Sleepless Horus, watch me as I lie, curtained with the stars when ye arise, and part the skies and mount the royal bark. They said the ancient words in shameful English. Their hearts rose up like feathers. In the hidden place, and Horus stepped into the flood of noon, shedding his light upon the worlds. It was in Birmingham it happened. Week after week, in the papers, the proof appears in their faces. Week after week, seeing the same moment grow clearer, raising the water. Filling the vessel, raising the water, filling the vessel. Oh, electromagnetic light, shaduf. Ancient hands bearing water. Ha! The star broke over the tub. All righteousness. Not deceived by sunshine nor the light from a man's desire. Deceived by desire, so that in the moment the people cast light from their bodies, light being the white premeditation, the simple fashion. What they want is light. Another source to equip their dry want firelight, space light, discretions of neon. At least, so to appear natural where the sun is, 360 degrees of light, consumed in the labors of comfort that cries for the balm of all that is natural, desire. Bathing in the dark, the water glowing in this plastic curtain, suddenly heated. As another expels past satisfactions, cold as she washes gas tears from her man's eyes, we hate you. Hot on her soft thigh like the dog's breath at noon by the courthouse, we hate you for that. But ancient hands raised this water as the street preachers have a good understanding. Hear them. O Israel, that. Down here is the place crying for the common privilege in a comfortable land. Their anger is drawing the water. Their daughters is drawing the water. Their kindness is laving and oiling its patience. That day, the figures on the trucks inspired no one. Some threw the water on their heads. They was Baptists. And that day, Horace bathed him in the water again, and Orisha walked amid the waters with hatchets where Allah's useful white men came there bearing the water and made our street Jordan, and we stepped into our new land. Praise God, as it's been since the first time through the tear of a mother. So, as you can see throughout the poem, he is collecting together different sources and weaving them into his own tale as a poet. You see references to the Egyptian myths like Horus. He also mentions Orisha, which is from West Africa. There's Allah. He references, of course, what was happening during the civil rights era as people were protesting and showing their rage for the injustices that were happening in the world. I think it's also important that he mentions through the tear of a mother and thinking of tears in terms of this kind of bubbling up of rage, this bubbling up of sadness, but also a kind of representation of this fracturing of self, the tears, right? And also the kind of contradictions of fire and water, and through that dynamic play between fire and water, you kind of have the concept of the wave rising up. um, but also the idea of how do we get light, and light itself representing again that play between the flow and movement like water, but also the fieriness of this of light as well. So you see this constant play between different sides throughout the poem, and that this dynamic play between different sides creates this new work as well. Okay, so let's go to the next poem. So, Time Step. Let's read a couple of poems from there. Let's read Downtown Boom. So, Downtown Boom. There are no gospel singers anymore. On the corners, they held down for Jesus. Valets, valet, valets park cars at restaurants for fancy people, on expense accounts or dates. So many times people come up to me and say, Billy, hey, wait a minute, you not Billy. You can see the new ballpark just past the courthouse. But which way is redemption? Again, the contradictions in the poem, but also the need for more public voices or public poets who will speak to the public about what's going on and tell the truth about what's going on, and the multiple contradictions that happen in society, right? The valets who park cars for fancy people, rich people, the, you know, but also the contradictions of himself as a person, that people come up to him thinking he's somebody named Billy, but he's not Billy, right? That the self it is not a kind of static idea either, that you could be you can have doppelgangers somewhere else, right? That just as much as there's not a static idea of society, there's not a static idea of self either. And Equinox was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Wordsworth. 1. There may be other roles you recognize. Sailors at night watch, soldiers on picket, but we are shepherds now, and it is spring, and we are talking. Okay, so we're not shepherds, but this is useful play. Like shepherds on a dark hillside, drawing lines between the stars, we reach beyond ourselves to meet ourselves. Or are we talking just to fill the space between us, to get over a century that ends in fireworks and worldwide efforts to undo the future? Then we were dancing. This is my real life. The day is still wet from the morning's rain. Pavements begin to steam. Killer 1970s guitars rattling the dash, driving west into a Majolica landscape. The city in the rear view collapsed by night, abandoned by the sun. At best, a graveyard chants. Time to get your grip and move on. Oh, preach us some pleasant nonsense, por favor. Amuse us, O Lord. We are the audience for your sneak preview of heaven. Thrust into this florid maze, trust curiosity to find its way to cleverness. A long awaited legion of idolaters arriving after giddy pilgrimage. Then came the prism vision as we saw the world through tears. 2. No, it is spring. 3 days of rain, not biblical, but more than this ground could take. Standing water everywhere. After 3 days of rain, they look like lakes. These fields near Hockley, fields waiting for cotton, corn, or soy, tract homes or condominiums or little malls glimmering like fish scales in the sun as a sheet of egrets settle in besides the lakes. That will not be here in 3 days, in fields that will not be here in 3 days. But we were talking. Shepherds or boys at useful play. You find the married men at 4 o'clock leaning against their trucks beside the roads, sharing halfpence or sixpacks, or in the city at a cocktail lounge trying to prolong the day's escape. But there are others who are not here, men who have years to speak of farmers, retired mechanics. Old men gather at breakfast to direct the day into its starting gate, booting the sun along a slotted course above the never-ending shadow puppet dance of power. The energetic pettiness of mundane busyness. These high priests of expected disappointments raise their polyphonic song. Life is unpleasant, but predictable. If this is solace, then these men standing up against the wall, these are the guardians of future pathways. But it's spring. 3. You feel like skipping, but the costume wants a more processional step. Will there be ruins where we walk? Will our footfalls echo purposes? Talking together as gray-haired men with the guy, you looked up at the stars when you were boys and wondering if there's a God, a girl, a goal, a meaning to the universe, and knowing now you really do not know much more than you did back then. These conversations, like a diamond's facets, like sunlit on fields suddenly made lakes. The subject always the same, yet seems transparently deflecting something deeper, more personal, demanding more attention when you think it over as you will, inventing what you should have said. Too late for that now, and next time will be deceiving. A boy's job to listen to the old men's lies and learn the music. A boy's job is to listen to the old men lie and learn the music. I never been nowhere where the old blues singers been. But I swear to my soul, I don't want to go there again. As you can see, this poem, again, despite it being a different poem, repeats some of the same themes of his previous works. The contradictions, the acceptance of the contradictions, that it just is what it is, that despite things changing, that some things don't change, some things just stay the same, and that constant interplay between these different things, that is that constant that is always happening. And last, I want to share this essay that Lorenzo Thomas wrote. I could have had a V8 essay on poetry and the vernacular. Okay. So this is a lecture that Lorenzo gave at Poetry Project. And I think it also continues this kind of radio-poetics that he has of this kind of duplicity of language and communication. Throughout this lecture, he talks about the differences between poetry and vernacular speech. That vernacular speech is everyday speech that you talk on the street, and poetry is this kind of re-speech, in a sense, a kind of speech where you're gathering everything that is said and then transmuting it into this kind of higher speech. In other words, a kind of hieroglyphics. So let me read some of it. So let me begin with an optimistic observation. All discourse is intentional and premeditated. We cannot stop to think, we are always thinking, even if circumstances sometimes impinge upon our judgment and our utterances, therefore betray poor thinking. Talk fast and think before you speak are parallel guidelines that usually result in flashy blunders of candor or solicited lies. Perhaps we are considering events transacted in nanoseconds, but I insist that almost all human activity is premeditated. Poetry, as we all know, is an often effective remedy for the sometimes life-threatening ailment of spontaneous speech. Poetry is formulaic language, a cure for blurting. Whenever poetic speech pretends to be vernacular language, it does so with the power of all deliberate artifice, and a disclaimer should flash across the screen of your brain and be imprinted in the wax of your ears. Just to digress, I must mention my favorite disclaimer from Sleazy TV station in Houston. The Sharon print on screen and the voiceover tells us in properly solemn tones, the following program may be unsuitable for many viewers. Discretion is advised. Once again, the back to the proem, right? The preamble to the following content. Talk about industrial strength premeditation. You knows I got to watch that movie. But as Max Schulman once said, I digress. Actually, Max Schulman said that thousands of times, but I digress. I'm really supposed to talk about our topic, the poetry of everyday life. The relationship between poetic diction and the vernacular utterances of everyday life is adversarial and parasitic in both directions. Poets become poets because we, this happy breed, have, through dint of genius, figured out an alternative to the shucks, I could have had a V8 syndrome. We live in an age of growing illiteracy in a nation determined to destroy regional dialects and accents and impose a bland, least common denominator standard broadcast or edited American English on its inhabitants. Curiously, English as an official language is the project of a political regime that prates about a philosophy of government decentralization and non-intrusion into citizens' lives. In any case, I am here to say that poetry is not and cannot be vernacular expression. No matter what it may pretend to be, and pretend is the signal word, poetry is by definition heightened speech. It is the stuff of dreams and nightmares, not dimly unpremeditated slips of tongue around the water cooler. When poetry attempts to depict everyday life, it is either ventriloquy and often ironic, or documentary and usually polemic and satiric. Quite often, poets who attempt to capture the language of the people think of the people as fair game. Of course, such poets, basking in their own sense of personal superiority, have nothing but good intentions. William Blake, I think, told us where that road leads. So you can read the rest of the essay on Poetry Project's website. But again, you see how Radio-Poetics fits into this lecture as well, and thinking about that he's gathering language, but he's also transmutating all the language and communication that is gathered. And that's what poetics is. Poetics isn't simply just speaking back what is heard, but collecting all that information, processing it, interpreting it, and then creating something new, a heightened kind of language out of all that has been collected within the poet. It's kind of similar to Audre Lorde's poem Power, in which she talks about needing to know the difference between poetry and rhetoric. Poetry is about interrogating society, interrogating the self, interrogating everything that you absorb into your body, versus rhetoric is kind of just speaking back what's already heard, kind of in a sense of what Lorenzo says here about marketing, right? I'm trying to sell you something. I'm speaking back to you what you want to hear, versus digesting what you said and interpreting what you said. Okay. So now, after sitting with me through all these poems, this workshop's prompt. So I would like for you to create your own broadcast. And in this broadcast, I would like you to write a poem or any form of writing that's in the form of a podcast or radio broadcast. And how would you write your words with an awareness of the multiple audiences tuning into what you're saying? Those audiences could be different cultures, different societies, different groups of people. It can even be about the past and the future. It could be about everyday life versus the stories that you read, the myths that you read, and how, in taking into an awareness of all these different groups, how would you write something and create something absorbing in all those knowledges from these different groups. And if you do write something, please feel free to share it with me. Here is my contact information for Jam Journal and J Expressions. If J Expressions is the mobile library project that I curate, you can follow the newsletter at tinyletter.com/jexpressions. You can also follow me on Twitter at jexpressbooks and IG at jexpressionsbookshop. And also you can send donations to the publication and production costs for Jam Journal, which will have a launch in November. I accept donations through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App. So thank you once again for joining me for another Art Teks workshop, and stay tuned for next month's workshop as well. Thank you, and bye-bye.